When I drew nigh the Nameless City, I knew it was accursed. I was travelling in a parched and terrible valley under the moon, and afar I seen it protruding uncannily above the sands as part of the corpse may protrude from an ill-made grave. Fear spoke from the age-worn stones of this hoary survivor of the deluge, the great-grandmother of the eldest pyramid, and a viewless aura repelled me and bid me retreat from the antique and sinister secrets that no man should see, and no man else had ever dared to see. Remote in the desert of the Arbry lays the Nameless City, crumbling and articulate, its low walls nearly hidden by the sands of the uncounted ages. It must have been thus before the first stones of Memphis were laid, and while the bricks of Babylon were yet unbaked. There is no legend so old as to give it a name, or to recall that it was ever alive. But it is told in whispers around campfires and muttered about by grandmas in the tents of sheiks, so that all tribes shun it without wholly knowing why. It was of this place that Abdul al-Hazred, the mad poet, dreamed the night before he sang his unexplainable couplet. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die. I should have known that the Arabs had good reason for shunning the Nameless City, the city told of in strange tales but seen by no living man, yet I defied them and went into the untrodden waste with my camel. I alone have seen it, and that is why no other face bears such hideous lines of fear as mine, why no other man shivers so horribly when the night wind rattles the windows. When I came upon it, in the ghastly stillness of unending sleep, it looked at me, chilly from the rays of the cold moon amidst the desert's heat, and as I returned, it looked. I forgot my triumph at finding it, and stopped still with my camel to wait for the dawn. For hours I waited, till the east grew grey, and the stars faded, and the grey turned into roseal light, edged with gold. I heard a moaning, and saw a storm of sand stirring among the antique stones through the sky was clear and the vast reaches of the desert still. Then suddenly, above the desert's far rim, came the blazing edge of the sun, seen through the tiny sandstorm which was passing away, and in my favoured state I fancied that for some remote depth that came a crash of musical metal to hail the fiery discs as when Manon hails from the banks of the Nile. My ears rang and my imagination seethed, as I led my camel slowly across the sand to the unvocal stone place, the place too old for Egypt and Moreau to remember, that place which I alone of the living men had seen. In and out amongst the shapeless foundations of the houses and palace I wandered, finding never a carving or inscription to tell of those men, if they were, who built the city and dwelt therein long ago. The antiquity of the spot was unwholesome, and I longed to encounter some signs or device to prove that the city was indeed fashioned by mankind. There were certain proportions and dimensions in the ruins which I did not like. I had with me many tools, and I dug much within the walls and obliterated edifices. But progress was slow, and nothing significant was revealed. When night and the moon returned, I felt a chill of wind, which brought new fear, so that I did not dare to remain in the city. And as I went outside the antique walls to sleep, a small, sighing sandstorm gathered behind me, blowing over the grey stones, though the moon was bright and most of the desert still. I awakened just at dawn from the pregnant of horrible dreams, my ears ringing as for some metallic peal. I saw the sun peering readily through the last gusts of the little sandstorm that hovered over the Nameless City, and marked the quietness, the rest of the landscape. Once more I ventured into those brooding ruins that swelled beneath the sand like an ogre under the coverlet, and again dug vainly for the relics of the forgotten race. At noon I rested, and in the afternoon I spent much time tracing the walls in the bygone streets and the outlines of the nearly vanished buildings. I saw that the city had been mighty indeed, and wondered at the sources of its greatness. To myself I pictured it all the splendours of an age so distant that Caligula could not recall it, and thought of Sarnath the Doomed that stood in the land of Nar when mankind was young, and of Ib, that was the cavern of grey stone before mankind existed. All at once I came upon the place where the bedrock rose stark through the sand and formed a low cliff, and here I saw with joy that seemed to promise further traces of antediluvian people. Hewn rudely upon the face of the cliff were the unmistakable facades of several small, squat rock houses or temples. Those interiors may preserve many secrets of ages too remote for calculation, though sandstorms had long since affected any carvings which may be on the outside. Very low and sand-choked were all of the dark apertures near me, but I cleared one with my spade and crawled through it, carrying a torch to reveal whatever mysteries it might hold. When I was inside, I saw that the cavern was indeed a temple, and beheld plain signs of the race that had lived and worshipped before the desert was a desert. Primitive altars, pillars, and niches, all curiously low, were not absent, and though I saw no sculptures nor facades, there were many singular stones clearly shaped into symbols by artificial means. The lowness of the chiseled chamber was very strange, for I could hardly more than kneel upright, but the area was so great that my torch showed only part at a time. I shuddered oddly in some of the far corners, for certain altars and stones suggested forgotten rites of terrible, revolting and unexplainable nature, and made me wonder what manner of men could have frequented such a temple. When I had seen all the place contained, I crawled out again, avid, to find some of the other temples might yield. Night had now approached, yet the tangible things I had seen made curiosity stronger than fear, so that I did not flee from the long, moon-crossed shadows that had daunted me when I first saw the Nameless City. In the twilight, I cleared another aperture, and with a new torch crawled into it, finding more vague stones and symbols, though nothing more defined than the other temple had contained. The room was just as low, but much less broad, ending in a very narrow passage, crowded with obscure and cryptical shrines. About these shrines I was praying when the noise of the wind end of my camel outside broke through the stillness and drew me forth to see what could have frightened the beast. The moon was gleaming vividly over the primal ruins, lighting a dense cloud of sand that seemed blown by the strong descending wind for some point along the cliff ahead of me. I knew it was this chilly, sandy wind which had disturbed the camel, and was about to lead him into a place of better shelter, when I chanced to glance up and saw that there was no wind atop the cliff. This astonished me, and made me fearful again, but I immediately recalled with the sudden local winds I had seen and heard before the sunrise and sunset, and judged it as a normal thing. I decided that it came from some rock fissure leading to a cave, and watched the turbid sand to trace its source. Soon, perceiving that it came from the black orifice of the temple, long distance south of me, amongst out of sight. Again the choking sand cloud I prodded towards this temple, which I neared. It loomed larger than the rest, and showed a doorway far less clogged with caked sand. I would have entered had it not have been the terrific force of the icy wind almost quenched my torch. It poured madly out of the dark door, sighing uncannily as it ruffled the sand and spread about the weird ruins. Soon it grew fainter, and the sand grew more and more still, till finally all was at rest again. But a presence seemed stalking amongst the spectral stones of the city, and when I glanced at the moon, it seemed to quiver as though mirrored in a quiet waters. I was more afraid I couldn't explain, but not enough to dull my thirst for wonder. So as soon as the wind was quiet gone, I crossed into the black chamber from which I had come. The temple, as I fancied it from the outside, was larger than either of those I had visited before. It was presumably a natural cavern, since it bore winds from some region beyond. Here I could quite stand upright, but saw that the stones and altars were as low as those in the other temples. On the walls and the roof, I beheld for the first time some traces of the pictorial art of the ancient race, curious, curling streaks of paint that had almost faded or crumbled away. And on two of the altars I saw, with rising excitement, a maze of well-fashioned, curvilinear carvings. As I held my torch aloft, it seemed to me that the shape of the roof was too regular to be natural, and I wondered what the prehistoric cutters of the stone had first worked upon. Their engineering skill must have been vast. Then, a brighter flare of the fantastic flame showed me that for which I had been seeking, the opening to those remoter abysses whence the sudden wind had blown, and I grew faint when I saw that it was a small and plainly artificial door chiselled into the solid rock. I thrust my torch within, beholding a black tunnel, with its roof arching low over the rough flight of very small, numerous and steeply descending steps. I shall always see those steps in my dreams, for I came to learn what they meant. At the time I hardly knew whether to call them steps or mere footholds in a precipitous descent. My mind was whirling with mad thoughts, and the words of warning of the Arabs' prophets seemed to float across the desert from the lands that men knew to behold the Nameless City, and that men dare not know. Yet I hesitated only a moment before advancing through the portal, and commencing to climb cautiously down the steep passage, feet first, as though on a ladder. It is in this terrible phantasms of drugs or delirium that any other man can have such a descent as mine. The narrow passage led infinitely down, like some hideous haunted well, and the torch I held above my head could not light unknown depths towards which I was crawling. I lost track of the hours, and forgot to consult my watch, though I was frightened when I thought of the distance I must have to be traversing. There were changes of direction in the steepness once I came to a low passage, when I had to wriggle feet first along the rocky floor, holding my torch at arm's length just beyond my head. The place was not high enough for kneeling. After that were more and more of the steps, and I was still scrambling down intermittently when my failing torch died out. I did not think I noticed at the time, for when I did notice, it was still holding it high above me, as if it were ablaze. I was quite unbalanced, with the instinct of the strange and the unknown, which had made me wander upon the earth, a hunter of far, ancient, and forbidden places. In the darkness there flashed before my mind fragments of my cherished treasury of demonic lore, sentences from Al-Hazred, the mad Arab, paragraphs from the apocalyptical nightmares of Damascus, and the infamous lines of the delirious Emile Dalivmoud of Gauthier de Metz. I repeated queer extracts from the mutterings of Afribs, the demons that floated with him down in the Oxus, later chanting over and over again a phrase from one of Lord de Nancy's tales, the unreverberate blackness of the abyss. Once, when the descent grew amazingly steep, I recited something in a sing-song from Thomas Moore, until I feared to recite more. A reservoir of darkness black as witches' cauldrons are when filled, with moon drugs in the eclipse distilled, leaning to look if foot might pass down through that chasm I saw beneath. As far as vision could explore the jetty sides as smooth as glass, looking as if its vanished o'er, with that dark pitch the sea of death throws out upon its slimy shore. The time had quite ceased to exist when my feet again felt a level floor, and I found myself in a place slightly higher than the rooms in the two smaller temples, now incredibly far above my head. I could not quite stand, but I could kneel upright. In the dark I shuffled and crept hither and thither at random. I soon knew that I was in a narrow passage whose walls were lined with cases of wood having glass fronts. As in that Paleozoic and abysmal place I felt such things as polished wood and glass, I shuddered at the possible implications. The cases were apparently ranged along each side as the passage as regular intervals, and were oblong and horizontal, hideously like coffins in shape and size. when I tried to move 2 or 3 of the further examination, I found that they were firmly fastened. I saw that the passage was a long one, so floundered ahead rapidly and creeping run, which would have seemed horrible had any eye watched me in the blackness, crossing from side to side occasionally to feel my surroundings and sure the walls and rows of cases still stretched on. Man is so used to thinking visually that I almost forgot the darkness and pitched the endless corridor of wood and glass in its low, studied monotony as though I saw it. And then, in a moment of indescribable emotion, I did see it. Just when my fancy merged into real sight I cannot tell, but there came a gradual glow ahead, and at once I knew that I saw some dim outlines on the corridor and the cases, revealed by some unknown subterranean phosphorescence. For a little while it was exactly as I had imagined it, since the glow was very faint, but I mechanically kept on stumbling ahead into the stronger light, and I realized that my fancy had been but feeble. This hall was no relic of cruelty, like the temples in the city above, but a monument to the most magnificent and exotic art. Rich, vivid, enduringly fantastic designs and pictures formed of continuous schemes of mutual painted whose lines were coloured were beyond description. The cases were of strange golden wood, with fronts of exquisite glass, and contained the mummified forms of creatures, outreaching in grotesqueness the most chaotic dreams of man. To convey any idea of these monstrosities is impossible. They were of the reptile kind, with body lines suggesting sometimes the crocodile, sometimes the seal, but more often nothing of which either the naturalist or the paleontologist had ever heard. In size they approximated a small man, and their forelegs bore delicate and evidently flexible feet, curiously like human hands and fingers, but strangest of all were their heads, which presented a contour violating all known biological principles. To nothing can such things be well compared. In one flash I thought of a comparison as varied as the cat, the bulldog, the mystic satyr, and the human being. That Jove himself had so colossal a protuberant forehead, yet the horns and the nonsenseless of the alligator-like jaw placed the thing outside all established categories. I debated for some time on the reality of the mummies, half suspecting that they were artificial idols, but soon decided that they were indeed some paleontologian species which had lived in the Nameless City was alive. To crown their grotesqueness, most of them were gorgeously enrobed in the costliest of fabrics, and lavishly laden with ornaments of gold, jewels, and unknown shining materials. The importance of these crawling creatures must have been vast, for they had held first place among the wild designs of the fascinated walls and ceiling, which matchless skills had the artists drawn them in the world of their own, wherein they had cities and gardens fashioned to suit their dimensions. I could not think but their pictured history was allegorical, perhaps showing the progress of the race that worshipped them. These creatures, I said to myself, were to the men of the Nameless City what the she-wolf was to Rome, to some totem beast is to a tribe of Indians. Holding this view, I thought I could trace roughly the wonderful epic of the Nameless City, the tale of the mighty sea-coast metropolis that ruled the world before Africa rose out of the waves, and its struggles in the sea shrank away, and the desert crept into the fertile valley that held it. I saw its wars and triumphs, its troubles and defeats, and afterward its terrible fight against the desert, when thousands of its people, here represented in allegory by the grotesqueness reptiles, were driven to chisel their way down through the rocks in some marvellous manner to another world, whereof their prophets had told them. It was all vividly weird and realistic, and its connection to the awesome descent I had made was unmistakable. I even recognized the passage. As I crept along the corridor towards the brighter light, I saw the later stages of the painted epic. The leave taking the race that had dwelt in the Nameless City and the valley around for 10 million years. The race whose souls shrank from the quitting scenes their bodies had known so long. There had been settled as nomads in the Earth's youth, hoeing out the virgin rock, those primal shrines at which they would never cease to worship. Now that the light was better, I studied the pictures more closely, and, remembering that the strange reptiles must represent the unknown man, pondered upon the customs of the Nameless City. Many things were peculiar and inexplicable. The civilization, which included written alphabet, had seemingly risen to a higher order than those immeasurably later civilizations of Egypt and Chaldea. Yet, there were curious omissions. I could, for example, find no pictures to present the deaths of funeral customs, save such were related to wars, violence, and plagues, and I wondered, in the recites shown concerning the natural death, it was as though an ideal of earthly immortality had fostered its cheering illusion. Still, near the end of the passage were painted scenes of the utmost picturesque of extravagance, contrasted views of the Nameless City and its desertion and growing ruin, in the strange new realm of paradise to which the race had hawed its way through the stone. In these views the city had the desert valley here had shone always by moonlight, a golden nimbus hovering over the fallen walls and half revealed the splendid perfection of former times, shown spectrally and aloofly by the artist. The paradisal scenes were almost too extravagant to behold, portraying a hidden world of eternal day filled with glorious cities and ethereal hills and valleys. At the very least, I thought I saw signs of an artist's anticlimax. The paintings were less skillful, as much as bizarre, than ever held wildest in earlier scenes. They seemed to record a slow decadence of the ancient stock, coupled with the growing ferocity towards the outside world from which it was driven by the desert. The forms of people, always presented by the sacred reptiles, appeared to be gradually wasting away, though their spirit is shown hovering above the ruins by moonlight gained in proportion. Emaciated priests display the reptiles in ornate robes, cursed the upper air and all who breathed it. The one terrible final scene showed a primitive-looking man, perhaps a pioneer of ancient Atrium, the city of pillars, torn to pieces by members of the elder race. I remember how the Arabs feared the Nameless City, and was glad beyond this place that the grey walls and ceiling were bare. As I view the pregnant and mural history, I approached very closely the end of the low chiselled hall, and was aware of a great gate, through which came all of the illuminating phosphorescence. Creeping up into it, I cried aloud in transcendent amazement of what lay beyond, for instead of the other brighter chamber, there was only a illimitable void of uniform radiance, such as one might fancy when gazing down from the peak of Mount Everest upon the sea of a sunlit mist. Behind me was a passage so cramped that I could not stand upright in it. Before me was an infinity of subterranean effulgence. Reaching down from the passage into the abyss was the head of a steep flight of steps, small numerous steps like those of the black passages that I had traversed, but after a few feet of glowing vapours concealed everything. Swung back, open against the left-hand wall of the passage was a massive door of brass, incredibly thick and decorative, with fantastic bas-reliefs, which could, if closer, shut the whole inner world of light away from the vaults of the passages of rock. I looked at the steps, and for some nonce dared to try them. I touched the brass door, and could not move it. Then I sank, prone to the stone floor, my mind aflame with prodigious reflections which not even death, like execution, could banish. As I lay still with closed eyes, free to ponder many things I had lightly noted, and the phosphorus came back to me with a new and terrible significance. Scenes representing the Nameless City in its heyday, the vegetation of the valley around it, and the distant lands of which the merchants traded. The allegory of the crawling creatures puzzled me of some universal prominence, and I wondered would it should be closely followed by a pictorial history of such importance. In the frescoes of the Nameless City I had shown the proportions fitted with the reptiles. I wondered what its real proportions of magnificence had been, reflected a moment of certain oddities I had noticed in the ruins. I thought curiously of the lowness of the primal temples and the underground corridor, which had doubtless hewn thrusts out of deference to the reptiles' deities they honoured, though it was perforce reduced by the worshippers to crawling. Perhaps the very rites had been involved by crawling and intermention of the creatures. No religious theory, however, could easily explain why the level passages of that awesome descent should be as low as the temples, or lower, since one could not even kneel in it. As I thought of the crawling creatures, those hideous mummified forms were so close to me. I felt a new throb of fear. Mental associations are curious, and I shrank from the idea that, except for the poor primitive man torn into pieces in the last painting, mine was the only human form amidst the many relics and symbols of primordial life. But as always in my strange and roving existence, wonder soon drove out fear, for the luminous abyss that it might contain presented a problem worthy of the greatest explorer. That weird world of mystery lay far down to the flight of peculiarly small steps. I should no doubt that I had hoped to find those human memorials that the painted corridor had failed to give. The frescoes had painted unbelievable cities, hills and valleys in the lower realm, and my fancy dwelt on the rich and colossal ruins that awaited me. My fears, indeed, concerned the past rather than the future. Not even the physical horror of my position in that cramped corridor of dead reptiles and antediluvian frescoes, miles below the world I knew and fancied by another world of eerie light and mist, could match the lethal dread I felt at the abysmal antiquity of the scene and its soul. The ancientness so vast and measurement so feeble seemed to leer down from the primal stones and rock-hewn temples in the Nameless City, while the very latest of the astounding maps and the frescoes showed oceans and continents that man has forgotten, with only here and here some vaguely familiar outline of what could have happened in the geological eons since the paintings ceased and the death-hating race resentfully succumbed to decay. No man might say. Life had once teemed with the caverns of the luminous realm beyond. Now it was alone in the vivid relics, and I trembled to think of the countless ages through which the relics had kept a silent and deserted vigil. Suddenly there came another burst of acute fear, which had intermittently seized me ever since I first saw the terrible valley of the Nameless City under the cold moon, and despite my exhaustion I found myself stirring frantically to the sitting posture and gazing back along the black corridor towards the tunnels that rose to the outer world. My sensations were much like those which had made me shun the Nameless City at night, and were inexplicable as they were poignant. In another moment, however, I received still greater shock to the form of a definite sound of which broken and utter silence of those tomb-like depths. It was deep, low, moaning, as of a distant throng of condemned spirits, and came from the direction of which I was stirring. Its volume rapidly grew. Still, soon it reverberated frightfully through the low passage, and at the same time I became conscious of an increasing draught of cold air, likewise flowing from the tunnels of the city above. The touch of this air seemed to restore my balance, for I instantly recalled the sudden gusts which had risen around the mouth of the abyss each sunset and sunrise, one of which had indeed served and revealed the hidden tunnels to me. I looked at my watch and saw that sunrise was near, so braced myself to resist the glare of which, sweeping down from the caverns home, had swept forth at the evening. My fear again waned low, since a natural phenomenon tends to dispel broodings over the unknown. More and more madly poured into the shrieking, moaning night wind, into that gulf of the inner earth. I dropped prone again and clutched vainly at the floor, for fear of being swept bodily through the open gate and into the phosphorescent abyss. Such fury I had not expected. As I grew aware of the actual sipping of my form towards the abyss, I was beset by 1,000 new terrors and apprehension and imagination. The malignancy of the blast awakened an incredible fancy. Once more I compared myself shudderingly to the only other human image in that frightful corridor, the man who was torn to pieces by the nameless race. For in the fiendish crawling of the swirling currents there seemed to abide a vindictive rage, all stronger because he was largely impotent. I think I screamed frantically near the last. I was almost mad. But if I did so, my cries were lost in the hell-born babel of the howling wind wraiths. I tried crawling against the murderous invisible torment, but I could not even hold my own as I was pushed slowly and incredulably towards the unknown world. Finally, reason must have wholly snapped, for I fell to babbling all over that inexplicable couplet of the mad Arab Al-Hazred, who dreamed of the Nameless City. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die. Only the grim brooding desert gods know what really took place, what indescribable struggles and scrambles in the dark I endured over what Abaddon guided me back to life, where I must always remember and shiver in the night wind till oblivion, or worse, claims me. Monstrous, unnatural, colossal was the thing, too far beyond all the ideas of man to be believed except in the silent, damnable small hours when one cannot sleep. I have said that the fury of the rushing blast was infernal, cacodemoniacal, and its voices were hideous with the pent-up viciousness of desolate eternities. Presently those voices, still chaotic before me, seemed to be beating brain to take articulate form behind me, and down there in the grave and unnumbered eon-dead antiquities, leagues below the dawnlit world of men, I heard the ghastly cursing and snarling of strange-tongued fiends. Turning, I saw the outlined against the luminous ether of the abyss which could not be seen against the dusk of the corridor, a nightmare horde of rushing devils, hate distorted, grotesquely panloid, half-transparent devils of a race no man might mistake, the crawling reptiles of the Nameless City. And as the wind died away, I was plunged into the gold-peopled blackness of the earth's bowels. For behind me, the last of the creatures, the great brazen door, clinged shut with a deafening peal of metallic music, whose reverberations swelled out in the distant world to hail the rising sun of Memnon hails it from the banks of the river Nile.